Professor Lapavitsas, thank you for being with us. It's a great honor for us to be with you. Today I would like to talk to you about economics, but also politics as well. So my first question will be about the politics, about the issue which is widely discussed across the world. It is the rise of populism and let's say the crisis of the representative political institutions. So let's start from a century ago to talk about the current world. Like in his first widely known book, like Economic Consequences of Peace, John Maynard Keynes wrote about, describes the daily life of the middle-class Londoner who is basically enjoying and is using the first globalization's new technologies like telephone. He is calling different parts of the world, like making investments, buying some goods, and is sure that these goods will be at his doorstep soon. So basically, he's sure that like the world is globalized, world is interconnected, like everything is closer. But what Keynes writes about this guy, about this Londoner, is that he's totally blind and cannot recognize the kind of rise of nationalism and other forms of some extremism. So he cannot recognize this process, which ended in World War I. So my question, Professor Lapavitsas, to you is, could you describe what kind of world are we living in today? So, and if this world, does it look like Keynes' world a century ago, which he described?
Let me say, first of all, that it's a great pleasure for me to be here, to be in Georgia, to be in Tbilisi. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here.
Thank you.
The question you ask me, in some ways, is the most difficult question of the time, of the era. You're right about Keynes, but in answering, I'd like to go back not so much to Keynes, but to Karl Polanyi.
Right.
Karl Polanyi, as you know, in his great book, The Great Transformation, discusses precisely the social and economic questions that you're addressing. The expansion of the market. In his time, he wrote that book in 1944, the expansion of the market in his time and coming up to the Second World War, the growth of capitalism across the world, the spread of it everywhere, the market penetrating everything, all aspects of society, and then a reaction to it. A reaction to it from below, a kind of recoil of society towards the market for a variety of reasons. Because of poverty, inequality and poverty, but also because the market, as we know, destroys social connections. It breaks up the social links, it destroys communities, it destroys the organic way in which people like to relate to each other. It replaces all these things with money, the nexus of money. That's a great lesson for today. For the last 4 decades, we've been living through a period in which what Polanyi described was just a tiny part of what we see today. Yeah. The expansion of the market.
Yeah, in daily life.
Everywhere, the penetration of it everywhere is tremendous. That creates inequality. That creates estrangement, alienation. That creates the breaking up of social links. One has to look for the roots of populism there. It's a kind of almost blind automatic reaction against what the market does. Humanity, society wanting an answer. Unfortunately, it's looking for these answers among populists, with which I don't agree at all personally. But you've got to understand where it's coming from. Sure. It's a human reaction, society trying to reassert itself, to find links above the market.
Professor Lapavitsas, in your famous books, for instance, like Profiting Without Producing, you basically write that the modern crisis and the structural problems of our era are derived from the financialization of the late capitalism. So we see the extraordinary rise of finance and its huge influence on politics. So could you tell us more about the financialization process and what are the examples in today's global economy?
Financialization is a characteristic feature of capitalism of the last 40 years. We've talked about the growth of the market, the globalization, the expansion of the market. One key aspect of that is the spread of finance. We can all see that the sector that has benefited most from globalization the last 40 years is finance. And finance has not only grown but penetrated so many aspects of life, so many aspects of everyday life for ordinary people, but also of the economy. That's characteristic particularly of the mature economies. You find it in the United States, you find it in Great Britain, you find it even in France and so on. But you increasingly see it in developing countries too. You see it in poorer countries. The most crucial feature for developing countries perhaps is the penetration of finance into the life of household. Indebtedness by ordinary people, workers and others for housing, for consumption, for education, for health. As private enterprise and the market replace social provision, and as wages feel pressure and incomes feel pressure, finance.
So this is kind of sign that the banks now are not financing the productive sectors of the economy, but they are financing the households, and the profits, the main part of the bank's profits or financial institutions' profits comes from the households, not the industrial sectors, right?
It depends on the country. It depends on the country. We can see a tendency of that type across the world. The extent of it depends on the country. So when you look at the United States, the great crisis of 2007-2009 had to do with lending to households, profits made out of households, and even the poorest households. Not financing production, but lending to very poor people.
Subprime mortgages, right?
Subprime mortgages. Lending to the poorest people in American society, often black or Latino, people who were marginalized. Even these people received loans, and then these loans were processed through the financial system. Profits were made out of these people income or out of speculation on these people's income.
And in your books, you're like saying that this is not the result of only the result of the policy, but it's the structural processing within the capitalism, in the late form of the capitalism. So
it certainly isn't just policy. Policy is important, obviously. We see policy encouraging this by creating certain types of banks and leading banks towards housing and household income, making it a source of profit. We see policy doing it also by encouraging people's savings for pensions, for insurance or whatever else to end up in the stock market. And there you have speculative activities out of which banks and others make profits. We see that, but it isn't just policy. It isn't just policy. It is also structural, and it has to do with how enterprises work. The biggest enterprises today, the big multinationals in the United States, in Germany, in Britain, are not investing. Investment is very weak. Therefore, productivity is also weak. Productivity growth is weak. And what the big enterprises do now is to sit on enormous amounts of money. The liquid wealth that the big corporates hold right now is tremendous.
So in other words, it means that if in the era of the golden age of the capitalism, like if the big firms were accumulating their money in the productive sector, now the big cash they now have, and they don't need the banks, they are now accumulating in the financial sector, not in the industrial sector. Right?
There is definitely a process of this type. What we see is weak investment. We don't see the classic picture that usually we identify with American capitalism or German even capitalism and so on. Big business makes big profits, invests in production, creates new wealth, employs people. No.
It doesn't have any.
That is capitalism of 50, 60 years ago. What happens in the West, in the mature capitalist countries, including Japan, is that big businesses sit on huge amounts of money, which they then use in a variety of ways, sometimes financial ways, and make profit out of finance, or seek to make profit out of games, out of financial games. Financialization of productive capital, in other words, is fundamental to this. The place that's different is China.
If you remind us the words of the Giovanni Arrighi, he would say that it's the last stage, like it's the crisis. You know, the financialization of the economy, as Arrighi was writing, is the result of another hegemons coming in the capital system, right? Why it's not happening?
Arrighi says that, and it's a very nice scheme he draws up. It's a kind of cyclical thing.
Right.
From Genoa, we move to Amsterdam. From Amsterdam, we move to London. From London to New York. And from New York, he thinks we will move to China. Well, history is not as neat as that.
Yeah, but we have the signs of crisis about the trade wars, for instance. Are there kind of signs of this, hegemonic.
Sure, but the crucial thing here is that China does not owe its growth to American capital moving in. In Arrighi's cyclical world, Dutch capital would move to London, and that would create British industrial capitalism.
It doesn't happen.
In China is not the case. China is a different process. It's a very, very interesting process. China is an unusual place. We see signs of financialization even in China. Tremendous growth of the financial system, speculation and so on, but different type of financialization to the West.
If the financialization is the kind of historic transformation of capitalism, it's the kind of latest stage of the capitalism as such, my question is, what was before and what is supposed to be next?
Again, you're asking me very difficult questions. When we look at what came before, when we try and, in other words, identify periods, historical periods, to understand what's happening to capitalism, global capitalism, certainly from the end of the Second World War to the middle of the 1970s, everybody agrees that was the golden era of capitalism. And the French regulation school have called it the Fordist era. That's a very good term, actually, because it captures mass production, rising incomes, mass consumption on the basis of rising income, not on the basis of financialization and borrowing. A kind of capitalism with greater equality, strong controls over finance, and strong state intervention. In the United States, in Britain, and so on. People forget about that, but that's what was happening then, and that was the period of capitalism with the fastest growth ever. That came before. That came to an end in the 1970s with the great crisis of the 70s, the oil crisis.
Stagnation.
And all of this. Then we entered a period of 40 years of neoliberal domination on the basis of the end of that Fordist Keynesian control period. We had neoliberal domination. We're living through it. Neoliberalism is coming to an end. Financialization indicates also the end of neoliberalism. It's obvious, it doesn't work anymore. Neoliberalism doesn't work anymore. It's misfiring across the world, it's clear. Those who take a historical perspective can see it very clearly. If you're involved in the day-to-day politics, if you look at the day-to-day policy making, you probably will miss it. If you take a historical perspective, it's clear. Yeah. What will happen after that? I don't know.
Let's see.
But I can tell you that from my recent work, which we'll publish pretty soon, I think that the golden period of financialization in the United States is over. It's over.
So what is the fate of developing countries in this context? What is the right developing policy agenda which they should pursue?
I'll tell you two things about that, which might have some relevance to Georgia. I don't know. I don't pretend to offer advice on Georgia, but I'll tell you 2 points on it which are important. What we've witnessed since 2001, that was the last Turkish crisis. 2001, where and also the Argentine crisis at the time, and just before it, the great crisis of East Asia.
Yeah, and tequila crisis in Mexico.
That was before that, but around 1998, 99, 2000. That's the last sort of bunch of developing country crisis. Turkey being the last one, major crisis. After that, the IMF intervened and so on, different things followed in Argentina. After that, what we had was a period of stability for developing countries in the sense of absence of crisis, because the great crisis of 2007, 2009 is developed country crisis. What happened in developing countries during that period was financialization as well. That's the most interesting thing. We observe advancing financialization of especially middle-income countries, Turkey, Mexico, South Africa, Brazil, countries with significant disposable income for large numbers of the population. The banks financialize and create financial regime. The companies also borrow abroad. They take on foreign exchange risk. We are just about to see now the next bout of developing country crisis. It's actually breaking out. I don't think Turkey will avoid it. I think there'll be a major crisis in Turkey. Argentina probably will have a major crisis too, and then we will see. This will be, from my perspective, the first financialization crisis of developing countries.
So the first crisis from the financial sector, not the other sectors of the economy, right?
The other sector will also be involved. Typically, I think what will happen, and that's how it looks in Turkey, probably other countries too, is this. Turkish enterprises, the big ones, are overborrowed. They've borrowed enormously. They seem to have borrowed abroad. Possibly through Turkish banks, via European or other paths. They've borrowed heavily, they've borrowed short-term, and they've borrowed in dollars or euros. They've taken a lot of foreign exchange risk on their balance sheets, which is characteristic of the expansion of finance of the last 4 decades. What is happening in addition to that is that for the first time Turkish households are also very heavily indebted. That's not the main driver of the crisis. It's the enterprises that have borrowed heavily. But now Turkish households are also indebted. The combination of the two, heavy debt by enterprises and substantial debt by households, doesn't look good for Turkish banks.
Before I ask you about some comments on Georgia's case, I will ask you about the last questions on the global economy. You wrote much about, you wrote book about the Eurozone crisis, in 2012. So some economists predicting now that this year will be kind of recession year for the many countries in Eurozone. So what is the monetary structure of the Eurozone is the main basis of the crisis going on or happened in 2009? And where is the way out? How they should overcome these problems? We need the political solution, or is there any space left in economic terms where we find some solutions on the crisis?
Europe introduced a monetary system more than 20 years ago now almost, which is actually badly malfunctioning. It's a monetary system that restricts growth and acts to create division between core and periphery, significant divisions between core and periphery. The core is highly unstable, and it is actually dominated by German big business right now. German industry is the only clear beneficiary of the way the European Union has unfolded. Not because of investment. What I mentioned to you previously about financialization, you observe in Germany. Not much investment, not much sustained productivity growth, suppression of wages. Wage restraint is the key thing in Germany.
Hard laws, right, in 2000.
Hard laws and wage restraint creates a competitive advantage. The euro is weaker than the Deutschmark would have been, so Germany can also compete globally. They've done well, but the legs are of clay. It's not strong because it competes in cars, it competes in chemicals, it competes in machine tools. But the dynamic industries of today are basically artificial intelligence, telecommunications, that kind of thing. Germany is way behind, and that's an indication of poor investment and poor technological prowess generally. That's the reality of Europe.
So if you look back to the history when they were creating this monetary system, the whole idea, the whole political idea of the monetary system of Maastricht Treaty was to restrict the ambitions of Germany. The France created the system against Germany, right? But it happened vice versa, right? The Germany won, and the rest of the team the lost, right? Because the main beneficiary is the German. So how it happened?
Absolutely. It's the biggest miscalculation by the French elite in a very, very long time. The calculation was by Mitterrand, President Mitterrand and the others, that we bring in a system through which we will tie Germany down. Germany had just been reunified. We will tie Germany. We will tie Germany down. The decision making will be communal. Therefore, we will manage it. It hasn't worked out that way. What has happened is Germany has come to dominate economically by keeping wages down and gaining competitive advantage. And it also dominates the mechanisms of the monetary union. And that is now a very clear advantage. France cannot compete economically with Germany. Italy cannot compete economically with Germany. Italy is dead in the water. It has been dead in the water for 2 decades. There is no growth in Italy, nothing. So Europe is stagnating. Germany is the leading country, but doesn't really offer leadership, doesn't really offer any new path for European capitalism altogether. Europe is not in a good place right now. So maybe I can tell you something from that about developing countries generally, because some areas of Europe are actually developing countries.
Right, peripheral countries.
Yeah, peripheral countries, especially old Eastern Europe. When you look at Eastern Europe or Central Europe, it's like a second periphery around Germany. Not just the periphery of the Mediterranean, but now a periphery around Eastern Europe and Central Europe, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. What you get there is some industrial growth because of German FDI, foreign direct investment, and because of a kind of promotion of industry of sorts, but not much investment again. What's the lesson for this? For developing countries, which is what you asked me just before, I'll tell you what I think it is. Without industrial strategy, that would find a new way of connecting the public sector with the private sector, a new kind of coexistence and mutual benefits. Without an industrial strategy of this type and without a financial system, a banking system that will support the industrial strategy, growth is not possible. Dynamic growth is not possible.
So the industrial strategy is important. So that's the good point. So that's why I want now to connect it to the Georgia's case. Well, Georgia is the country whose economic development policies during past 20 years was under the supervision of Washington consensus, you know, the international institutions and their recommendations, like as Stiglitz is calling it, like do as we say, not as we did, right? So we did everything, like we liberalized the foreign trade, deregulating the financial and economic spheres, like foreign investment policy. We created the foreign investment policy based on the cheap labor, you know, like we restrict the state's role in the industrial policy. And as a result, we got the tourism as the main engine of the economic growth, right? But everything stayed the same. The poverty level still the high, the unemployment high, wages stagnating, people are leaving the country. So we have not conducted these policies properly, or what's happening? Why does not it get the results? It brings the results.
I can give you a general answer about the Washington consensus. I cannot apply to Georgia because I don't follow the Georgian economy closely. But I can give you a general answer about the Washington consensus. The Washington consensus doesn't work. It's a set of policies and set of ideas and theories that manifestly do not work. The fastest growth in the world, the last 3-4 decades, has been from countries that have ignored the Washington consensus. Countries of Asia, China being the biggest one, and in China, the last thing you see is the Washington consensus. The reason why China has grown is not because it applies the Washington consensus. Obviously, there is an element of free market, but there is state intervention, public enterprises, tightly regulated financial system, and a mechanism which calls itself a communist party, but it's not really a communist party in the traditional way. It's just a way of controlling the market. That's the fastest growth we've seen in the world, nothing to do with the Washington consensus. Wherever the Washington consensus has been applied methodically and religiously, the result is, as you point out, weak growth, inequality, malfunctioning economy and society, often emigration of the young because they cannot get good jobs and so on. The Washington consensus is a major failure. Growth requires industrial strategy, targeted industrial strategy, finding a way of placing your own country, especially a small country which hasn't got very many resources, in the global system, working out where your dynamic advantage might be, supporting it, creating it through mechanisms of public control over the financial system, public provision of funds, a system of supporting investment and supporting growth.
So we basically say that we need the state's intervention to find the Ricardian comparative advantage, because the markets cannot like identify it, right? As the Keynes said, that like the market is the poor master but the great servant, right?
Sure. You need, and I mean, no one is saying that you need to abolish markets. This is just, I mean, old
nonsense.
Stuff. As for comparative advantage, the crucial thing here is dynamic comparative advantage, not static comparative advantage. But because static comparative advantage, if we follow Ricardo's example, Portugal would have been producing wine for the next 300 years. Yeah, that's not the point, right? The point is to create dynamic comparative advantage. For that, you need strategy, industrial strategy, and you also need a kind of private enterprise, a kind of private capital that itself is prepared to invest, prepared to do things for the country, prepared to be creative and productive. That doesn't come from the Washington Consensus. Right. The Washington Consensus usually creates private capital that looks for quick profits, looks for fast ways of making money, and making money out of ephemeral activities.
Right. Yeah, and what it created is the massive inequality, right? In developed countries and developing countries as well. So my last,
Go on.
Yeah, my last question is about the inequality. Like, it's kind of ritual every year that the Oxfam Foundation presents the World Inequality Research, and every year the number of people, like small few people, who owns more than 4 billion people, the wealth, who owns more wealth than 4 billion people, is reducing this number of people. So how such inequality affects the global economy, especially in developing countries, and what is the connection between the process of financialization and the inequality as such?
When neoliberalism became the dominant ideology 4 decades ago, people predicted growth of inequality. It is inherent in the neoliberal approach to economic policy and to the economy that inequality will grow. Some people who advocated neoliberalism accepted that and said still the poor will do better as the economy as a whole becomes richer. That's not the case, right? And what we've seen is enormous growth of inequality. Much of that has come through finance. Financialization has facilitated that because the very rich have made huge profits through financial transactions, by playing financial games, through share buybacks in the United States, through the stock markets and other mechanisms of finance. Financialization is an excellent vehicle for the rich to become richer through bonuses for the financial institutions and so on. The other way in which inequality has grown is, of course, tax. Yeah. The rich don't pay taxes. It's as simple as that. The tax avoidance by big corporations and by the richest people in the world today, and I'm talking about the West, I'm not talking about developing countries, is embarrassing. I mean, it really is bad. If you don't pay taxes, then you'll become much richer yourself, of course, but there won't be the money to maintain the public infrastructure and the welfare infrastructure. So the combination of neoliberal policies, financialization, and tax avoidance and lowering of taxes for the very rich have tremendously increased inequality. There has to be policy towards that. Any kind of policy that aims for growth must take care of inequality as well. It's not true that growth comes from, in the modern system, from the very rich becoming even richer and dynamic in what they do. Growth requires certain elements of equality. You've got to take care of everybody. You've got to create the domestic demand. You've got to create the substratum on which accumulation can take place. It's not true that growth requires or would come from inequality in the sense that the rich will make the money and then they will invest the money and then they will seek more money and then that will create wealth for all. No. Growth requires a basic level of equality, requires a society in which people have access to a good income and so on, and they can create the domestic demand that is necessary for the economy to proceed and accumulate. And growth also requires a certain level of equality to create the substratum on which accumulation in private enterprise can act. And that is quite apart from the social justice dimension. Who wants to live in a society in which the richest chief executives get paid 500 times the basic wage? I mean, what kind of society is that? Who is worth this kind of money? No one. No one is worth this kind of money.
Yeah, and my very last question, like let's get back to the first question about the crisis of the political institutions and the representative institutions in modern era. Well, after 2008 and 9 crisis, financial recession, like who is supposed to trust on economists and trade mainstream economists and institutions, right? So the crisis of the modern era is also the crisis of trust, lack of trust on people who represent millions of other people, right? So what's your perspective? Like, should we trust these neoclassical trained economists, these politicians? What are your recipe to follow? You know?
Sure. I'll tell you what I think about that. As neoliberalism expanded and the market created this kind of dehumanizing situation, destroyed social links, the thing that we also observed was, in a sense, the depoliticization of economic policy. And that's crucial for the weakness of democracy. It goes right to the heart of the rise of populism as well. The discontent that we see in society because of the measures that have been applied go together with the weakening of democracy. And the weakening of democracy is because, in large measure, economic policy has been depoliticized. In other words, in Europe, you can vote for anti-neoliberal policies if you come from the left of the political spectrum. You can vote for anti-neoliberal policies if you come from the right of the political spectrum. Yes. Okay, as you see that in Italy, we saw it in Greece 3-4 years ago. Yeah. In the end of the day, the European Union or whoever makes policy, Troika. The experts, the Troika or the experts that you mentioned, tell you, no, you've got to do what the system says, right? Whatever the logic, whatever science presumably says,
science.
Right? Science.
Common
whatever. By science, people mean what they've learned at the university to which they went, Harvard or Princeton or whatever it is, that's science. So you've got to do that because science says that. Then the question immediately arises on the part of ordinary people. Why vote? What's the point of voting? I can vote for the right, I can vote for the left. I'm being told I've got to do what the experts tell me. Ordinary people then say there's no point voting and there's no point listening to the experts because the experts don't talk for me. They talk for other people, for other things that are happening. And then populism grows. The weakness of democracy is rooted in that as well, is rooted in that any kind of policy that will challenge neoliberalism must aim for strengthening democracy. There is no other way for working people, ordinary people to express what they need, to have their own interests come to the fore. Democracy is vital.
Yeah, and as it happens in real sciences, when theory is not proved, the theory is changed. It does not happen in economics, right?
No, but it does, exactly. Economics has evolved in the strangest possible way. It's a little bit like I said. It's almost like a church with its own rituals and its own doctrine, and it keeps reproducing itself. And it's very difficult to do well because, of course, like any kind of structure, you've got to go through various barriers, and publishing is very difficult, and you've got to reproduce the established knowledge, and then you end up being exactly like the people you joined.
It's all about power as well.
There is internal power, of course, which is very, very, and it's also a very conservative discipline now. The idea of financialization that we discussed, for example, is the most interesting new idea to emerge in social sciences. You find it now across social sciences. It's being discussed even in the realm of policy, not in economics. Economics will take time to accept it and start incorporating it. But that's how it is. It was the same with globalization. Economics did not accept the term globalization until very, very late. It's a very conservative discipline, very conservative discipline. that works in the way that I just mentioned to you.
Professor Lapavitsas, thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.